Helen Keller once said, "Life is either a daring adventure or nothing at all." As a child in Chanute, Kansas, Osa Johnson probably never would have imagined what future adventures were in store for her. On March 14, 1894, Osa Helen Leighty was born to William H. and Belle Leighty. Growing up, she was an avid tomboy who would rather hunt rabbits than work in the kitchen. At 16, Osa met 26-year-old Martin Johnson when he was in Chanute to showcase pictures from his voyage with Jack London. Osa was appalled by the fact that the people in his film were not dressed, and she told him it was horrible. Months later, they met again, and he was attracted to the 5-foot, vivacious brunette. Weeks later, they eloped to Kansas City in 1910. From there, the adventure began.
She was what I call a rootstock Kansan. And by that I mean an individual who embraces life, who puts up with adversity, who can see the good even in difficult situations, and who carries on. And there's a lot of people who don't do that. Now, if you spend time in Africa and you deal with the indigenous African people, you grow to admire them immensely because they have to put up with so much. The Africans have this quality of rootstock Kansan, in my opinion, because they're such essential, resilient people, and Osa seemed to be that.
Osa's personality was larger than life and had a profound impact on her professional endeavors.
I think Osa loved the dynamic range of what she was able to do. I mean, she was able to wear those wonderful Paris dresses and travel the world and go to the premieres of their movies and have that type of lifestyle, but also then living literally years of their lives in the wilderness, in jungles and in savannas and traveling. It was difficult.
Together, Osa and Martin set precedent for future explorations with their studies of confined cultures across the world.
They brought Africa, in a realistic sense, to the United States certainly, and to much of the world, in particular with their films, but also with their books. Other folks had gone and written books, and of course there were all kinds of stories and myths coming out of Africa. But when they actually photographed the habitats and the wildlife and the people and the cultures, people were hungry for that. So that made people conscious and aware of Africa. By the time I was born, and as I was growing up, then Africa was an established entity and was known through the Johnsons as well as other people. I think they were one of the reasons why Africa became so well known, was because they brought it to the public.
Separately, they would not have accomplished what they did as two individuals, but together as a team, their strengths and weaknesses really did work together with each other. I suppose it's a little bit looking at them in black and white, but I tend to think of Osa as the extrovert, as the individual that went out and got along very well with native peoples, organized their safaris very well, loved animals, loved kids, and I tend to think of Martin maybe as the introverted, focused artist, thinking about his craft, his films, his photographs, and he had that kind of temperament. They did wonderful things in the South Pacific, Borneo, East and Central Africa.
From their ethnographic studies of faraway cultures never before photographed, the Johnsons were fortunate enough to capture on film. In 1917, on the Solomon Islands, they encountered the Big Nambis tribe of the northern Malekula. A group of cannibals, the Big Nambis would hold the couple captive until the intervention of the British. This experience inspired the movies Among the Cannibal Isles, Jungle Adventures, and Headhunters of the South Seas. Upon their return in 1919, they brought with them an escort for protection, but it was ultimately regarded as unnecessary.
Some groups have maintained a relatively traditional way of life, and others have changed rather dramatically. For example, the Pygmies in the Turtle Forest, the records that the Johnsons left are of customs, of ways of life that they just don't practice anymore. But other groups like the Maasai still do have a very traditional way of life. Some of the cultures that they were going into were very divided as far as the sexes, and the women in one group and the men in another, and they had to interact with them in different ways. But certainly Osa, being there with a film crew, really helped open up certain doors, if you will. She was very good at getting children to interact with her and be filmed, and then likewise with the women. I think it might be somewhat more of a traditional staying out of the way of what the men were doing. Osa could visit with them and find out what their lives were like and film them. That's certainly lended to their value and power of their documentaries.
Their first trip to Africa in 1921 influenced the feature films Trailing Wild African Animals, Martin's Safari, Osa's 4 Years in Paradise, and Simba. Visitations to the Maasai people of Kenya contributed to their studies as well.
Today it's easy to go to Africa. You get on a 747 and a day and a half later you're on safari in Africa. In these wonderful vans, and they're driving you through the reserves and the parks, and the animals are used to the vehicles moving around, and then you stay at lodges or tent camps, and people provide wonderful food, and it's a great experience. And with the Johnsons going there, they had to figure out what they needed to carry with them or take with them, number one, from the United States, get that all packed up and loaded onto ships, and then once they're over there, there are also different places they could get supplies from Nairobi and Mombasa, but that still took time also, and they had to load that all up onto their carts and wagons and their vehicles and transport that to wherever they were working. And that required a significant amount of organizational skill, and I really truly believe Osa was exceptional at doing that, of keeping the porters and guides and gun bearers and all their staff organized and moving together as a unit, and they absolutely loved their staff.
Osa was so good with a rifle that one of Kenya's most renowned white hunters compared her to Annie Oakley.
They had to present Osa not only as the huntress, as the adventuring woman, but also as the homemaker, if you will. They would show her also baking pies and being with children and loving the animals as well. It was a very difficult life for them, living that type of existence, essentially constantly being on a camping trip. I guess what drove them was the realization that their work had a long-term value. It was creating a record of a vanishing natural and cultural world from the first half of the last century.
In 1927, they were accompanied along the Nile with friend George Eastman, or better known as the developer of Kodak photography. After coasting down the river, Across the World with Mr. and Mrs. Johnson was released and was one of the first talkie films for the couple. In 1929, they visited the Mabuti culture of the Ituri forest in the Belgian Congo of Africa. Congorilla was produced entitled the first movie sound recorded in the African Serengeti. Osa was the first person to photograph a gorilla in its natural habitat. They received their pilot's licenses in 1932 from the local airfield in Chanute, Kansas. After receiving the green light to fly, the couple purchased 2 planes and took flight over Mount Kilimanjaro and Mount Kenya. This footage inspired their famed film, Baboona.
They became masters of working in the field, of filming in the field and developing their film there and keeping it safe and making sure it transported safely back to the United States and they could edit it and work on it there. We tend to look at how Osa was a filmmaker. She was passionate about her work. She was an excellent marksman, but very critical skill is organizing these safaris and keeping them moving and having the camp running well, and organizing the food and making sure they have all the supplies for developing the film and so on. I mean, she just was a master of that. Some British colonials were rather critical of the Johnsons because of their close interaction with their staff, but maybe that was just a little bit of the clash of cultures, American in a British colony at that time. But they just loved their staff, and in response, the staff was very loyal to them.
Their final trip together was in 1935, when they returned to the Borneo Islands, thus delivering the feature film Borneo to their eager fans back in the United States.
She was in part behind the camera, but she was also in front of the camera, and that was part of the appeal. I mean, it would have been one thing for Martin to go out there by himself and film the wildlife, the native peoples, and present that, but I guess in part they were travel logs, so they were actually showing how they lived on safari, how they traveled, and in particular Osa was the beautiful young girl from Middle America traveling the world and going to these exotic places and encountering interesting native peoples and wild animals, and that was that contrast. And their teamwork together, their different strengths and weaknesses balanced out each other, so they were able to create this wonderful documentary movies and inspired a lot of people to want to travel to see Africa. Really opened up those different parts of the world to Americans and Europeans.
In 1937, Martin and Osa were involved in a deadly plane crash near Newhall, California. Incoherent and injured, Osa immediately asked to see her husband. "Where's my husband? Is he badly hurt?" Assured by the stewardess that her husband was safe, Osa replied, "Oh, we have a speaking engagement this evening in Pasadena." However, Martin was killed in the crash and would never reunite with his beloved wife for another safari. After his death, she was distraught for years to come and suffered from intense alcohol abuse. Her partner, professionally and intimately, had been taken away from her life. Eventually, Osa gathered the strength to continue on.
She was very brave. I admire her. That was the life she was familiar with. Martin was her partner in life, and you lose half the team, it's very difficult. But I think looking at the photographs of her in the year after his death, she looks very brave. She's back up on stage telling the stories about their work, showing their films, and returned to Africa one more time in 1937 to act as a consultant for scenes used in the Stanley and Livingston movie with Spencer Tracy. But at the same time, that did have an impact on her life and her attitude and things of that nature. It was difficult for her.
She wrote children's books and toured as a public speaker. She advocated wildlife preservation and the legacy of her husband. In 1953, Osa suffered from a fatal heart attack and was found dead in her New York City hotel room.
I truly feel that their biggest impact is the legacy that they left behind. These films they shot, we estimate somewhere around 1 million feet of film that they shot, thousands of photographs, and as well as their writings. They wrote 18 books, over 100 magazine articles. But those films and photographs represent a record of the world that has changed significantly since the first half of the last century. And that legacy lives on in different ways. It's used by modern filmmakers, anthropologists, zoologists, but also their story. And to me, the story is what really brings it to life.
I think it's very difficult today for all of us living in this world that we're in, where everything is so much technology and almost literally magic, for us to fully comprehend and understand and appreciate what Osa did and what she went through and what she accomplished. And she wasn't doing it to prove a point, in my opinion. She was doing it because that's who she was. And she was in love with Martin, and Martin said, let's do this, and they went to Borneo and the South Seas and oh my gosh, so much. And just everything, from shooting a rifle to fishing to flying and planes. It's such an inspiration.